Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, in a little thatched cottage on the very edge of a large forest, lived a little girl with her mother and father. Her father worked all day in the forest as a woodcutter. He would cut down the tallest and thickest trees with his big, shiny and very sharp axe. In a clearing in the very middle of the forest, there was another beautiful thatched cottage. This cottage belonged to the little girl's grandmother, who was a very sweet old lady and who loved her granddaughter very much indeed. One day, the grandmother had given her beloved granddaughter a special present of a bright red cloak, which had a matching hood attached. The little girl loved it so that she wore it all the time. So much, in fact, that people called her Little Red Riding Hood. One autumn day, whilst her father was out working in the forest, Little Red Riding Hood was playing in the garden when she heard her mother calling for her. She went into the kitchen where the table was piled high with freshly baked cake and bread. "Ah, there you are, my dear," said her mother as she entered the kitchen. "I've been baking all day and I've made so much food, I thought it would be nice for us to share it with your grandmother, and a visit from you always makes her so very happy. Would you be a dear and take some food up to her cottage for me?" "Yippee!" cried Little Red Riding Hood. "A visit to grandmother's cottage!" And she ran into the hallway and put on her favourite red cloak and hood whilst mother packed a big basket of food. "Off you go, my dear," said her mother as she handed Little Red Riding Hood the basket of food. "And you make sure you go straight to grandmother's cottage." "I will, mother," shouted Little Red Riding Hood as she skipped off down the forest path. She hadn't gone very far when she met a wolf coming the other way up the path. The wolf walked over to her, pretending to be very friendly.
"Oh, hello, Little Red Riding Hood. So lovely to see you. Tell me, what have you got in your basket?"
"I've got lots of cakes and some bread," replied Little Red Riding Hood. "It's for my grandmother who lives in the cottage in the middle of the forest." The wolf licked his lips. He wasn't thinking about the cakes and bread. He was thinking about gobbling up Little Red Riding Hood. But he thought to himself, "If I'm clever, I can gobble up Little Red Riding Hood and then gobble up her grandmother for dessert."
"I'll tell you what, Little Red Riding Hood,"
said the wolf slyly.
"I haven't seen your dear sweet grandmother for such a long time. I'll visit her with you. For a bit of fun, I'll race you there."
"Oh, yes," replied Little Red Riding Hood. "What fun!" Then the sly wolf said to her,
"You follow this forest path, and I will find another way. Then we can see who reaches your grandmother's cottage first. Off you go."
With that, Little Red Riding Hood ran up the path and out of sight. As soon as she was gone, the wolf ran off through the forest as fast as he could. The wolf knew every shortcut and secret path through the forest, so he soon got ahead of the little girl. Just before he reached grandmother's cottage, the wolf crept around the edge of the new clearing that had been created by Little Red Riding Hood's father, who was still working there cutting down a very big tree with his axe.
"I'd best avoid him,"
said the wolf to himself. Very soon, the wolf reached Grandmother's cottage. He knocked on the front door. "Who is it?" called out Grandmother. "Who's knocking at my door?"
"It's me, Little Red Riding Hood,"
squeaked the wolf in his highest and softest voice.
"I've bought you some homemade cakes and bread."
"Oh, lovely," said Grandmother as she opened the door, ready to give Little Red Riding Hood a big hug. "Come right in. The door isn't locked, my dear." The wolf bounded through the door and gave poor old Grandmother such a fright. He pushed the little old lady into the nearby larder and he locked the door.
"You can keep in there," he smirked, "until I'm ready to gobble you up."
Then he ran into the bedroom and put on one of Grandmother's spare night dresses and her nightcap and jumped into bed just as there was a gentle knock at the front door.
"Who is it?"
said the wolf in his best grandmother voice. "It's me, Grandmother," said Little Red Riding Hood. "I've brought you some lovely homemade cakes and bread."
"The door is open, my dear,"
said the wolf, trying his hardest not to lick his lips.
"Come straight in, my dear. Come straight in."
Little Red Riding Hood walked in, put the basket on the table, and walked into the bedroom. "You sound very strange today, Grandmother," she said.
"I have a cold, my dear," said the wolf. "That's why I'm in bed. Why don't you come closer so that I can see you better?"
Little Red Riding Hood moved closer to the bed, but was shocked when she saw her grandmother. She gasped, "Why, Grandmother, what strong arms you have!"
"All the better to give you a big hug with," said the wolf.
"Why, Grandmother, what big ears you have!" said the little girl.
"All the better to hear you with,"
growled the wolf. "Why, Grandmother, what big eyes you have!" said Little Red Riding Hood, looking closer at the wolf.
"All the better to see you with," said the wolf.
"Why, Grandmother, what big teeth you have!" gasped Little Red Riding Hood.
"All the better to eat you with,"
snarled the wolf loudly as he threw back the bedclothes, jumping to the floor. Poor Little Red Riding Hood screamed as she realised who Grandmother really was, and ran out of the door. The wolf tried to grab her, but she managed to avoid his grasp and ran out of the front door, screaming at the top of her voice, with the very hungry wolf very close behind her. In the nearby new clearing, Little Red Riding Hood's father heard her screams.
"I'm coming!"
he shouted as he grabbed his big axe and ran towards the cottage. Just as he reached the cottage, he saw the wolf, still dressed in a night dress and cap. The wolf had trapped Little Red Riding Hood in the corner of the front garden and was closing in, ready to pounce.
"Get away from her, now!"
boomed her father as he ran full speed towards the wolf, with his big axe raised above his head, gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The wolf turned around, and when he saw Little Red Riding Hood's father heading towards him with that big axe, he let out a big howl and ran off in total terror into the thick forest.
"I think that's the last we'll see of that fellow,"
said father quietly as he knelt down and gave his little girl a big loving hug. "Thank you, father," sobbed Little Red Riding Hood, as they walked back into the cottage together. When they entered the kitchen, they could hear a faint knocking sound that appeared to be coming from the larder.
"Whatever could that be?"
said Father, as he opened the larder door slowly, with his axe at the ready, just in case.
"Grandmother!"
shouted Little Red Riding Hood as the little old lady stepped out of the larder. They all hugged each other and started laughing and dancing around the room together.
"Let's have afternoon tea together to celebrate,"
suggested Grandmother. So they all sat around the table with lots of lovely homemade cakes and bread and laughed together as they thought of the wolf running through the forest and far beyond in one of Grandmother's nightgowns and cap. Later on, Little Red Riding Hood and her father left Grandmother's cottage to head home. "Don't forget to lock your door, Grandmother!" shouted Little Red Riding Hood as they headed down the garden path. "You never know who will be knocking." They all laughed again and waved goodbye as Grandmother shut the door and locked it securely.